topic. Lies primarily in the fact as it exists today is of course relatively well understood. We know that there is a certain lack of fluidity about caste, and of course there is politicization of caste because it has emerged, especially in the 20th century, as an important marker for the democratic politics in the country. And there are many other things associated with caste, as we all know, and the sociologists of course have done great work as far as caste in its contemporary form is concerned. And some of the great works done in this field, of course, the French sociologist Louis Dumont, he took caste to the extent of treating the Indian people as a different kind of subspecies, probably called as Homo hierarchicus. And the riposte to Louis Dumont probably was given by Govind Sadashiv Ghurye, who had a very different interpretation of caste and varna, that is jati and varna, in the Indian history. And of course, then you had M.N. Srinivas somewhere probably in the middle between the two. So this was the work of the sociologists. But then there are others like Bernard Cohn, anthropologist. He also talked about caste and the social structure of the Indian society in his famous book Colonialism and Its Forms of Knowledge, in which he argued that much of what we regard as fixed in Indian history is probably a backward projection which was done during the colonial period. And then, of course, very important work of Nicholas Dirks, Castes of Mind. Again, it gives a very important argument that caste as it exists today is something that came into existence only in the modern period. There were different forms of identity and other things which sort of came together to constitute caste as we know today. Now, the other importance of today's lecture and of this topic is that it is addressing caste in its pre-colonial avatar, jati, that is in pre-colonial avatar. And as I alluded, it was very different in many ways. Of course, it is not as if this varna structure or jati structure did not exist. It existed in the Indian society, but we have to go to the specific empirical evidence in all parts of India to understand what were the forms in which it existed, what were the social interactions between people belonging to different professions, occupations, and different jatis and varnas, etc., etc. And I'm sure that today's talk is going to do precisely that. To my mind, one important difference between caste as we know today and caste as it existed in pre-colonial India, and of course in Rajasthan as well, these are the differences. First difference, of course, is that caste as it existed then provided for fluidity at four levels. One was that an entire caste, obviously, through the process of what later Srinivas called Sanskritization, it could sort of improve its rank in the Varna order. And sometimes a reverse process could happen because of a variety of reasons. Over the decades and over the centuries, a jati could come down in the Varna structure. And second form of fluidity that it provided was that an individual who followed a certain kind of profession, and I believe there is a lot of archival evidence, may start doing another thing, may join another profession, and over a period of years and decades may be accepted as a member of that caste. I believe that there is considerable archival evidence, primary evidence for this kind of thing also. And third, of course, was regional migration. When large numbers of people belonging to a particular jati, when they migrated from one region to another, quite often their status in that new society was different. It could be higher or it could be lower, depending upon the various circumstances, how they were accepted in the local society, who invited them to the local society, what were the land grants and privileges given to them, etc., etc. And fourth, of course, was the rise of the mixed castes, through which The Varna structure provided fluidity. Now, my last point, Rajasthan is especially important, and I, congratulate Divya for choosing this topic. Of course, she has done her research on the pre-colonial Rajasthan, so it's natural for her. But we had discussed the topic, and of course, I also suggested this to her. Rajasthan is especially important because Rajasthan in North India provides a very good example of a region where a certain continuity as far as state structure is concerned was maintained, and when where good archival records have also been maintained. So on the basis of those archival records, that primary evidence, a fairly reliable picture of jati as it existed at the local level, in all its complexity, I believe can be drawn. So with these words, I would now like to welcome Dr. Divya Cherian, and of course welcome our Honorable Director, Shri Sanjeev Nandan Sahai ji also, who has very kindly consented to be present here today on the occasion of this talk. And I welcome all members of the audience, and I request Divya, who is an assistant professor at the Princeton University and specializes in this field, to proceed with her lecture. Divya.
Oh yeah. All right. So first of all, deepest apologies for coming so late. It was not just one jam, but like multiple jams, which debatably could jams that I had to navigate, and I was very stressed out as it got closer and closer to 3. But thank you for your patience. Thank you for coming. And of course, thanks are due to Sanjeev ji for inviting me to share my research over here. It's particularly special to share my research here because I grew up in Delhi. I got my initial training as a historian in Delhi, and most significantly, I took my first steps as a historian under the guidance of the late Professor Nandita Prasad Sahai, who is the wife of the director, Mr. Sahai. So it's really special to share my research here with all of you. And thanks are due to Ravi also for organizing this lecture, and to Iqbal Ahmed as well for all the work he's put in. And other reasons that this is special is I have other scholars from various points in my scholarly journey. I have friends here from school. I have a friend here from Rajasthan State Archives with whom I first read these wahis together, had lunch. So it's really special. So let me get on, especially since there has been a big delay with my research. So to be in India and also to be an Indian abroad is to live with caste. It is to navigate caste. We read about it, we hear about it, and whether we admit it or not, we participate in it every day. But what about the history of this phenomenon, the past of caste, shall we say? And of course, Ravi has given us a sense of what we do know and think about the past of caste so far. So just to reiterate a little bit, on the one hand, we know from scholars of ancient India about the origins of caste as Varna and its proliferation as Jati. We also know about the early history of untouchability. On the other hand, we have a lot of work from historians of modern or colonial India about how modern technologies of rule, Enlightenment forms of knowledge came together to reshape caste, to elevate Brahmanical ideals as the determinants of caste in a way that they had never been before. But what about ancient and modern? What about the history of caste in medieval or early modern India, with early modern being the term that is, as the historians here will know, that is used for the period between the 15th and, in the case of South Asia, sometimes also the early 19th centuries. So there are, of course, a number of studies that focus on particular castes. So Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay, who just passed away, is very well known for the region of Rajasthan for his study of Rajputs. There are a number of other scholars such as Ramya Srinivasan, D.H.A. Kolf, Cynthia, who have written about the history of the Rajput caste or the Rajput community. Other studies of other elite groups, such as the caste of Brahmins, have been carried out. How does the idea of Brahmin, how does Brahminhood change, by Christian Lee Novetzky, Rosalind O'Hanlon, and there are studies of caste and scribal identity as well, for Bengal and Bihar, as well as for the Konkan coast. Still, others have turned attention to less elite groups. So we have, as I mentioned, my former advisor, the late Professor Nandita Sahai, has done for this region path-breaking work on the history of artisanal political action. We have also, in the case of Rajasthan, histories of the Jat caste. We have histories of leather workers. Either explicitly or implicitly, these studies argue, make a case for, and demonstrate the fluidity of the caste order, showing that, as Ravi also suggested, that particular groups could engineer or move up in the regional order. They also tell us how actively particular groups worked to defend their high status and their exclusive hold upon particular status symbols. We also know how new groups could be assimilated into a regional caste order, and even those groups that may embrace different religious faiths, new religions, would still remain within the caste order or renegotiate their place within it. Then we have studies of all India caste that kind of generalize based on their own research as well as the research of others. What do we say about caste as a whole? Here I'm thinking particularly of the work of Nicholas Dirks, the historians here would know, as well as Sumit Guha, both of whom I think their signal intervention has been to blast away the idea that caste was fixed, caste was rigid. Nicholas Dirks has shown how the role of the king was particularly important in fixing or allowing movement within the caste order. We also have the contribution that it was only in the colonial period that Brahminical ideas about what is caste, what is high, what is low, that becomes elevated only in the colonial period. Similarly, Sumit Guha has emphasized the role of economic and political relations in caste ranking in India before colonialism. So, against this backdrop of scholarly writing on caste, I am here today to argue that while fluidity and mobility were indeed features of caste before colonialism, there was a limit to the fluidity of caste. And that limit stood in the 18th century at the boundary that separated the untouchable from the touchable. And in this, I argue, which I won't focus so much on in this particular presentation, but that the figure of the bhangi was constructed as an embodiment, like the very physical form of this idea of untouchability, a living and like a tangible, a physical vector of untouchability that lived and worked within caste society. The bhangi was the untouchable par excellence. He could be amalgamated with other castes that were deemed as close or proximate to the bhangi. And I will share with you an order in which this kind of blurriness between the bhangi and other castes could determine where you drew that line between touchable and untouchable. So I make all these arguments, or I make this claim on the basis of my study of the 18th and early 19th century records of the Western Indian kingdom of Marwar, also known by the name of its capital, Jodhpur. The kingdom was ruled since the 13th century by the Rathod dynasty, which had in the 16th century accepted Mughal suzerainty. When Mughal control faded in the 18th century, the region experienced new kinds of state formation. And I think I can change the slide. So one of the manifestations of state formation in this time was the compiling of the orders of that were issued by the court, by the Rathod court, to its provinces into registers organized by year. These registers are called bahis, and for the Rathod kingdom, these are available at the Rajasthan State Archives from the year 1764 AD. This is what they look like, just so you have a sense of what I mean when I talk about a bahi. And the bahis can vary in size from this thick or even thicker to very slim, but they're these long bound volumes. So while going through these records, I came across an order, which I think now go to. Oh no, so sorry, this is the inside of the bahis, just so you have a sense of the kind of script and the writing that I'm talking about over here. These are not, or these are images from a published study that I have reproduced here. So in going through these records, of course, I found a range of fascinating material, but there was one that I have been particularly struck by, and I think some of you may have heard prior presentations by me in which I have brought up this one. which is an order dispatched by an officer named Pancholi Nandram to the magistrates of Medta and Nagaur, two of the most populous towns of the kingdom. And the order is, as you can see, I've transcribed it into modern Devanagari. अपरंच उठे शहर में सारा इनु कह देणो सुपोहर रात बाज्या पछे दोए घड़ी ताई श्री परमेश्वर रा नाव रोजीने लिया करे सु हिंदुवानु कहजो ने तुरक ढेड चमार थोरी बावरी हलालखोर अछेप जात हुए जीरा नु नहीं केणो ने फिर चौतरारा आदमी रोजीने शहर में फिर ने कया करे सुपोहर रात बाज्या पछे दोए घड़ी ताई सदा ही नाव लेवो करे श्री हजूर रो हुकम छे. So to translate, what it says is, instruct everyone in these towns to recite the name of Shri Parameshwar, which literally translates to the Supreme Lord, two ghadis into the night peher, or about a quarter of an hour past sunset every evening. Relay this to Hindus or Hinduvan, but not to the Achhe or untouchable castes. These being Turaks, Chamars, Dheds, Thoris, Bavris, and Halal Khors. By the order of His Highness, that's Sri Hajur, men from the magistracy should roam through the town daily, announcing that the name must always be recited two ghadis into the night peher. Now, there is much that stands out about this order. On the one hand, it names a community called Hinduvan, right? And on the other, it names a community called Achep. It doesn't specify who are the Hinduvan, which we can translate to a plural of Hindu, so Hindus. But what it does make clear is the Hinduvan does not include the Achep. And then it lists precisely who are the Achep, at least for this order. So they are Turaks or Muslims, Chamars and Dheds or leather workers, Thoris and Bavris, or which are perhaps best described as vagrant landless groups that were later classed as tribes, and Halal Khors, which is another name for bhangis. The point of the command is, of course, as you heard, to instruct the magistrates of these two towns to make sure that all those who are Hindus should say the name Sri Parameshwar, likely a reference to Vishnu. It was a creation of a public ritual. For this order specifies a fixed time every evening in which all except the Achep are to enunciate this holy name, coming together in action, enunciation, and sound. This, in my forthcoming book, is just one manifestation in the surviving records of 18th century Marwar of the hardening of the idea of the Achep or the untouchable through the use of this category in law and local politics. Elements of this order can be discerned in a large number of other petitions and commands inscribed in Rathore records, making clear that this command, even if it articulated this vision in the starkest, the most black and white terms, was not an isolated one in terms of its import or its meaning. And I will focus today, and there are actually so many strands that can come out of this one order, but I will focus today on the definition of the outcast, one not considered admissible into an imagined community, the Achep. Even as the order I just discussed lists precisely who was untouchable, it is clear through other records that the precise line separating the Achep and related to the Achep other groups that were deemed lowly, such as the Neech or the Kamir, this was a line that could shift. So I'll lay out before you a few other instances of the definition and the use of the word untouchable Achep in Rathore records. Then I'll explanation for why this effort to name, define the untouchable played out as it did in 18th century Marwar. And I will close then with a discussion of why these findings matter for scholarship on India before colonialism. Okay. And I think Sanjeev sir will recognize this map because decades ago he told me recently that it was he who worked with Nandita ma'am to trace out this map. So as I was looking to make a map for my book, I wrote a hurried email to Sanjeev sir's daughter with whom I'm in touch saying, where did you get that map? I need a map for my book. And she said, I don't know. I just remember helping my mom trace this map. And then when I asked sir about it recently, he said he also put together a number of maps to come up with this particular one. So it's really a rare and special map, and I could not just take it for my book, but I'm sharing it here, just so you can get a sense of, all of you know where Marwar is, but what the districts look like that I will be referring to. It might be too small for you to see particular names, but I might bring up some of the names of these districts in the next part of my presentation. So in the same year that the command that I just mentioned was issued, the thriving trading town of Pali, which was a district headquarter in Marwar, joined together to collectively petition the Rathore state's help in putting an end to the prevailing practice of all the townspeople drawing water from the same tanks and step wells. They said, "Talab Bawri sara hi log ekhan ghat bhare hai, pani bhare hai." Instead, they requested segregation in water access. Acceding this demand, the Rathore crown, so the state in Jodhpur, ordered the governor of Pali to ensure that the superior castes, that this order defined as Brahman, Mahajan, and others, filled water from one tank and the untouchable castes from another. And the precise wording is, ब्राह्मण महाजन वगैरह उत्तम जात तो एक घाट भरिया करे ने अछेप जात दूजे घाट पानी भरिया करे. It is noteworthy that the Mahajans banded together to make this appeal, and that in its response, the state included them in an imagined collective of Uttam Jatis or superior castes. The generalized and intentionally vague usage here of the label untouchable to encompass here everyone but Brahmins, Mahajans, and this undefined other elite caste was different. A much more precise listing that I mentioned from the earlier 1785 order. This suggests that untouchable could sometimes be deployed as a broad rubric that rhetorically subsumed everyone other than a handful of the most elite, and the precise application of this category in practice could have shifting contours. Despite the shifting contours of the category, the meaning of achep, however, remained consistent across its usages. It designated that group of castes with whom contact was considered socially and physically degrading by groups that had escaped this classification. The label was perhaps intentionally vague, more a placeholder to mark a community from whom a loud proclamation of distance was essential to eliding or covering an underlying relationship of inextricable entanglement. The naming of this community was necessarily at the hands of those who were not its members, and as a result, it was open to contention, to challenge, and to variation. From the perspective of the social elite, it could be so expansive, as you saw, as to encompass almost everyone who was not a merchant, Brahmin, Rajput, Charan, or Jat peasant. The untouchable, so imagined, could include all artisans, such as cloth printers, dyers, weavers, blacksmiths, and potters, and service providers too. More commonly in state orders, however. So even though sometimes we find that so many people can be considered untouchable, though some people never are, but more commonly in the bulk of the orders that do use this term, we find that it was a narrower category. That is precisely the ones that the order I began with named: leather workers, Muslims, vagrant hunters, and most essentially sweepers at its core. So to give you a sense of that kind of usage, some leatherworking castes who in Marwar went by names such as Chamar, Bhambi, Meghwal, Dhed, and Balai, and landless vagrant hunters like Bavris and Thoris appear. So this is expressed, as I said, most unequivocally in that order that I mentioned. But in 1801, the state's news writers informed officers in Jodhpur that a man in charge of taxing the sale of clarified butter or ghee in Sojhat district had not just taken a bribe of 1 rupee from a ghee seller named Bhambi Udio of a leatherworking caste, but he had also taken 1.5 seers of ghee in the Bhambi's own plate to keep for future sale. It was not the taking of the bribe that offended the crown's officers. Instead, they were horrified that the man took the ghee in the leather worker's vessel into his own home with the intention of selling it later. This created the risk of buyers purchasing the ghee without knowing its origins. And the order says, "Achep jatra vasan roghirat kard dujaro dharam sabat kir tare rahe." Or how does one's dharma remain intact after taking ghee from an untouchable's vessel? Asked the order. So it is clear then that Rathore officers were invested in the regulation of the boundary between the untouchable and the rest of the population. In another such case in 1782, the Crown in Jodhpur received news of a group of girls who the Mehta city magistrate's office had gathered. While it is unclear how these girls had been separated from their families, it is likely that their families had sold them due to economic distress, which we know because there are many cases of families selling children in times of distress. The Crown commanded the district magistrate of Mehta to dispatch to the capital city, to Jodhpur, a list that enumerated the caste origins of each girl. On behalf of the Rathore state, an officer called Pancholi Nathuram declared that, and this order is copied twice in the record, ऊना छोरियां में खातन लुहारी सुनारी नायण तुर्कनी तथा और ही अछेप इतरी जात वीना छोरियां हुए जीके किसी किसी जात री है न कितरी जनिया है अठे लिखचो. So essentially, they're saying other than the ones who belong to these castes like Khatan, which is carpenter, Luhari, blacksmith, Sunari, goldsmith, Nayan, barber, Turakani is Muslim. Other than these are all Acheb jats. Everyone who is not in this jat, please list their name and send it to us. So, and in yet another instance, when a female slave, a domestic slave called a Badaran, ran away with a servant, the master of this female slave and the servant, who was a Rajput, he tried to win back the cost of this runaway slave girl from the trader who had sold her by claiming that when selling the girl, the trader had withheld the girl's untouchable identity. He is quoted in the record as saying, "Aa Badaran to achep jaat thi," or that female slave was of an untouchable caste. These two examples illustrate that, at least in principle, a woman of untouchable status was not considered to be even fit to be a household slave. As we know from writing on slavery from the West, if slavery was a form of social death, then in the caste imagination, this death still could not erase the social attribution of untouchability upon a body. And the segregation between elite groups and untouchables was enforced in prison as well. In Jalore, the magistrate objected when the governor began to house untouchable and elite castes in the same cells of the town's jail. The magistrate complained to the crown and asked, "Rajput Mahajan vagere nu achhe bhela keen tareh rakhne aave." How can you house Rajputs, Mahajans, etc. together with untouchables? And in this case, the officer from the crown was a man named Purohit Kesodas, who then commanded on behalf of the crown that untouchables, here who specified as Meenas and Bhils, should be jailed separately from the Bhomiyas or Rajput landholders, Mahajans, and other elite castes going forward. And now I know this sounds like a whole listing of such references, but personally I felt that it is important to name and list each of the ways in which this particular word achep or untouchable came up in the record. So I will tell you two more or maybe three, and then I will move on to my argument. So Mahajan Rukma of village Agolai in Falodi district complained to the state in 1788 when his pregnant daughter died. The woman's husband, he said, had kicked her, causing her to go into labor. Right after the child was born, Rukma's daughter breathed her last. As Rukma's daughter's body lay on a funeral pyre, her husband, for reasons we don't know, got a Thori ascetic, Thori being among the castes that were listed in that original order as Achep. He got a Thori ascetic or Jogi to slit her womb. Sorry, this is a bit disturbing. So we don't know why he did this. It may have been to ensure that there was not maybe another unborn child remaining in her womb. Thoris, as was explicitly stated in that order, were considered achep, and as a result, the crown ruled that the Mahajan, who had kicked his wife and had this deed done, was guilty not only of the crime of kicking and killing his wife, but also of having a Mahajan woman's corpse slit by an untouchable. ईर तरह महाजन री बेटी री लात री दे ने मारी ने अछेप जात कने पेट. If these allegations were proven true, Jodhpur officers Mahajan Singh V. Moti Chand and Pancholi Fateh Karan commanded the Pali magistrate to fine Rukma's son-in-law. So that was to be his fining. Was a very common kind of punishment for a range of crimes in 18th century Rajasthan. So against this backdrop, where I have told you about these various instances in which particular castes were deemed untouchable, in which an effort was made to separate untouchable from the not untouchable, here I have one example among, certainly not the only one, in which the castes that were labeled untouchable resisted and did not simply accept this kind of segregation. So an example of this is that in 1797, the Meghwals, which are leather workers, refused to restrict their celebration of Holi to their own quarter in the town of Bilara. While every other caste was said in this order to have celebrated Holi in their own respective mohalla, their own neighborhood, the town's Meghwals chose to hold their festivities in the town's main bazaar. This disrupted the free movement of elite women that otherwise walked through the area, citing the merchant and priestly women's suffering caused by their inability to fetch water due to the polluting presence. And the words are Bhinta Chuti Had Sudhi Rahe, or they remain within the limits of their quarters for fear of ritual pollution, Bhita being a word for ritual pollution of the leather workers. The Mahajan officer Mohanot Sibukaran decreed that the governor of Bilara should threaten the Meghwals with punishment if they did not contain their festive celebrations to their own quarters in future. So, what do we make of these references to the practice of untouchability in 18th century Marwar? First, these orders and petitions are a unique vantage point into the history of the practice of untouchability in the pre-colonial past. So most studies of untouchability in the pre-colonial period are based on the study of literary texts, whether they are prescriptive codes, they are Brahmanical commentaries, they are didactic tales, they are hagiographies of particular holy figures, or they are devotional poetry. There is a large body of writing on caste and untouchability in ancient and medieval South Asia, tracing the origins of and changes in both caste and untouchability. For the early modern period, scholars of Bhakti literature, poetry in the voice of such untouchable Sant poets as Ravi Das and Chokamela, as well as hagiographies and sectarian literature, have built up a picture of untouchability as an idea and a discourse. But these sources leave open-ended the question of how untouchability was actually practiced in everyday life, which authorities enforced it and to what extent, and what its relationship was to historical changes, particularly in early modern South Asia. What these Rathore records that I presented before you can offer us foremost is a history of the implementation. So not just the idea and the discourse of untouchability, but the implementation of untouchability through state law and local politics in pre-colonial South Asia. And I emphasize here pre-colonial. Steps in this direction have been taken for Maratha territories and the Rajasthani kingdom of Kota in the 18th century. These studies show that some 18th century regimes, states, intervened in localized caste orders and that these interventions extended untouchables in their place. Other studies tell us about the place of such so-called untouchable groups as chamars and bhuiyas in regimes of land and labor, revealing the role of early modern expansion, agrarian regimes, conquest in inscribing the location of these castes in local power structures. The orders that I have gathered from 18th century Marwar, however, show that the mediations of 18th century states could extend beyond policing the place of untouchables and into redefining who was untouchable. Who was untouchable, what defined untouchability, and how it was imposed was, I show in this, in my work, was due to the play of historical forces. And the changing contours of the untouchable domain, in turn, shaped local and political orders, which is not something I am able to do in this presentation, but I argue that in my book. The outcast, far from being outside society and therefore outside history, was right at the center of it. And if we look at particular episodes of the deployment in local politics of this term ache, if we look at the episodes that I recounted just now, we notice the prominence of merchants and Brahmins in demanding or enforcing the boundary between elite castes and the untouchables. So to recount, in the case involving the pregnant woman, both the woman and the crown officer who issued the order were of Mahajan castes. In the quest for water segregation, the petitioners were Mahajans. In the order reporting the defiance of Meghwals, the groups said to be fearful of ritual pollution were Mahajan and Brahmin women, and the officer issuing the order was a Mahajan. In two other cases, the issuing officer was a Pancholi of a Kayast caste or a scribal caste that was dependent on the Marwar state for employment and was a small, demographically small caste in Marwar. And in one case, the officer in charge was a Brahmin. So, okay. The merchants of Marwar had, in the course of the early modern period, that is, since the 15th century, seen a transformation of their economic and political standing. And this, I could go on for a long time, so I'm going to really say it briefly. But they had been, as we know retrospectively, but they were active in trade, they were active in money lending. And as the Mughal Empire consolidated itself, they spread out in the 16th century to different corners of the Mughal Empire. And in fact, even beyond, there are references to Marwari merchants in the southern fringes of the Russian Empire. They are present in Iran. They were quite far, scattered far. And it was in the 18th century, with the decline of the Mughal state, that the sort of hold of the Marwari merchants on the flow of capital in South Asia took on a whole other level of success. Separately, in the case of Marwar, there was a kind of unique situation, which is that from the 15th century, successive Rathod kings began to incorporate merchants into administration at all levels. They would be in the local, in the provincial administration, they would be at the topmost levels of administration, including the equivalent of what would today be called prime minister, the highest minister of the land. And the reason for this was the effort to build a kind of polity that was a monarchical polity in which the king was the most powerful. So they wanted to cut against the claims of other Rajput rivals who could demand an equal share or a somewhat equal share as the king, based on their descent from a common ancestor, based on their shared caste status. So to cut against that, merchants began to play a bigger and bigger role in Marwar administration, to the extent that some historians of Indian business history might even explain the kind of dominance that Marwari traders had over the economy on the basis of the hold that they first had on politics within Marwar. To me, it's not obvious which came before the other, but certainly the two facets came together powerfully to impart to the merchants of Marwar an unprecedented place economically and politically in Marwar. And so I suggest, and I show in multiple other arenas in 18th century Marwar, how mercantile groups joined up with Brahmins and joined up with Rajputs, with particular Rajputs, in order to push forward a claim to inclusion in the highest rank of the local social order. So they not only remade their place in the caste order, but in the process, they also remade the logic underlying the local caste order, which again is part of my larger argument. I cannot fully explain that in this presentation, but that, I suggest, is part of the story of what is going on here in terms of these petitions that are brought before the Rathod state, and with the Rathod state itself being a merchant-run state. So how is all of this significant to anything, right? So one thing I will say, is I've already highlighted, is it allows us to write a history of the practice of untouchability in India. The other I think other takeaways from this is that the conception of a category of people of multiple castes that were united by the characteristic of being so ritually impure that they were not to be touched was not limited to normative Brahmanical prescriptions. Even in normative Brahmanical prescriptions, the category that we would today translate as untouchable was denoted through Sanskrit terms like Chandal, Pahya, and Antyaj that are not focused on physical touch. The term asprishya, literally untouchable, does occur in ancient Sanskrit texts, but its use is rare. Further, as Ambedkar cautions, scholars must be careful not to equate references to ritual impurity in Brahmanical texts with the actual practice of hereditary and permanent untouchability. So even as the emergence of the idea and practice of untouchability as permanent and hereditary in some texts occurred at, we know very well that in the textual level it had occurred well before the 18th century. These records show that in parts of 18th century pre-colonial South Asia, the idea of the untouchable existed as such, that is, with the touch part, and was put into practice through state law. This history of untouchability also tells us that there are limits to the fluidity, mobility, and fuzziness attributed by some to pre-colonial. These limits were etched upon the untouchable body, which was the material, tangible, and physical manifestation of that against which society defined itself. While the exact contours of untouchable could indeed be shifting, one caste group upon whom the application of this label was placed beyond dispute was that of sweepers. And again, as I said at the beginning, this is part of the argument that I cannot fully show in the time I have here, but the bhangi or the halal khor was a living reminder visible to all. And there are specific ways, I mean, very briefly, if I can tell you, is that in these state records, we find leather workers, particularly, for example, chamars, meghwals, dades, they come to the state, they appeal to the state for various disputes. But there are very, very, very few references in which the bhangi or the halal khor turns to the state. So it's almost as if they don't or cannot access the state. And then there are other ways in which the body of the bhangi is used as a tool of punishment, which I have, in which, for example, a bhangi is made to spit on someone as a type of punishment. This is not done for any other caste in this entire, body of record. So there is some a kind of an extreme that the bhangi occupies. Second, while the fixity of being untouchable was borne by some, so most of all by the bhangi, but also by these, Thori, Babri, Turak, and other castes that I mentioned, but the slipperiness of it for others was essential for the practice of power. Fear of slipping into this category could produce compliance to the behavioral expectations of local elites, and aspirations to rise out of it could similarly encourage conformity with the ethical codes and prescriptions of locally powerful groups. In all of this, the bhangi body served as the necessary index of a state of unsociality, and as I said, a constant physical reminder of the essence of untouchability. Finally, the ability of the category at shape to theoretically encompass all but the very elite made it a site for political struggle. Changes in social, economic, and political circumstances could generate different and shifting outcomes in terms of who exactly was untouchable and who was not. And in this, therefore, there was, and by site for struggle, I mean that there was a degree of agency that could and was exercised by groups to push against the strictures that were placed upon them. There certainly was a core to the category, constituted by leather workers, sweepers, and vagrant hunters, but there was room always for others to be added to it. It was this potential for expansion that drew untouchability into the orbit of history, leading to changes over time in terms of both its criteria and those who constituted it. And it's a small chapter of that I've shared with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Divya, for this very insightful lecture on the subject caste and outcaste in pre-colonial Rajasthan. We are now open to questions and brief comments from the audience.
Are you the person? Or do I call you?
No, I will. Okay. Yeah, we have the first question from Pallavi.
Thank
Please
you,
introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Pallavi Chakravarti, and thank you, Divya. Of course, I've read your work also, and it was a very nice talk. Learned a lot from that. So my just maybe it's more out of curiosity that I'm asking this question. That incident about the Meghwals which you spoke about, you just told about, I think from my understanding, maybe one part that they should be put to their place, and generally all of the bhangis that you said, they should be put to their place. Do these records also show what is the response coming from these, or are these just records which give about what is done to this caste rather than what is, as a response coming from that? That is just more out of curiosity. I would like to know.
Take up a number of questions before you answer. Meenakshi?
I'm Meenakshi Jain. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. What I'm asking is out of my own ignorance, because I've not done much on this. One is the role of barbers. Were barbers ever included among the untouchables? And why I ask this question is because in marriage rituals, barbers had a very important role to play. The offer of sending a girl to it was always carried by the barber. So that is one point. And second thing is that in the early colonial period, sweepers, they acted as spies for the British system. Because they would know who's the new person who's entered the area, who has committed crimes, who has committed robberies. So this role of sweepers in the colonial period, if you can tell us something, vis-a-vis the law and order situation and managing the law and order situation. Thank you.
I think we had please come and use the mic.
Yeah, so it's more of a comment and less of a question. I don't know.
Just be brief.
Yeah, I'll be brief. So I think you study untouchability as an important aspect in understanding caste in pre-colonial India, but I think it is limiting in many respects, and I don't know if you will be studying some of the aspects later, or if you have already studied these in your book. So first of all, like if when you talk about untouchability, it doesn't tell me much because we have millions of references that can, millions of archival sources that actually talk about untouchability in pre-colonial India. And for instance, when you look at this work by Baba Saheb Ambedkar on caste, the rise of the untouchables, he actually discusses hundreds of sources that talk about untouchability, and the earliest evidence he finds is from 323 AD actually. So talking about untouchability in the 18th century doesn't tell me much. And also,
well, let me
just one thing, just one thing. So another thing is that why I'm saying is this, because I also believe that this idea of having fluidity in the caste order actually works in the favor of Brahmin historians or upper caste historians who tend to argue this. And also the other point that I wish to raise is that you tend to say that that fluidity is limited to untouchability and touchability. This is just a question that I want to ask you. Did you look at some of the other aspects of caste to talk about fluidity or unfluidity or non-fluidity or rigidity among the other higher castes? For instance, the Varnas, the Shudras, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas. When I was looking at pre-colonial Punjab, I found that the Shudra representation in the kingdom of Maharaja Ranjit Singh was zero. So will you say that there is no rigidity in the rest of the Varnas? And did you look at, for instance, other aspects such as family laws and land revenue and land laws? For instance, when you look at pre-colonial Punjab, you actually see that the Jats paid the highest revenue against the Brahmins. Brahmins paid no revenue in pre-colonial Punjab. So you see hierarchy and a typical Varna hierarchy among the other Varnas as well. So what I see in pre-colonial Punjab myself is that it's a strict hierarchy in terms of Varna, and it's not limited to touchability or untouchability. So these are the few questions that I wanted to ask you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. Yeah. I'm Preetham Singh. I completed my MPhil from the University of Cambridge. Yeah.
Hi,
Yes,
thank you,
Varda.
Divya. This is Varada. Great presentation. Two questions. In examples that you gave, you spoke about role of women, and it seemed that they were the main stakeholders in sustaining those structures, primarily of untouchability. So especially in the context of intersectionality and caste and gender, how do you put women in this entire story? That's one. And second, your methodology seems to be state history, the records which are in the state archives. So is there any dichotomy in the state accounts and the social history, if I can use that term? So state history and the social history, is there any dichotomy that you could find during your research?
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
have sufficient number of questions.
Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you all for the questions. So yeah, this question of response is, from the all groups. I mean, I've shared here today what this particular category of untouchable groups. I think the tricky thing is that for each particular episode, it's very rare to find out what happened next. It's mostly do this is what we know is you could say the central level officers send a command to the district. We don't know what happened. We don't even know if it was implemented. Forget. Sometimes there can be a or sometimes if it's a longer record, rarely you do have that we sent an order, then this happened and this happened, but that's very rare. If I don't say, if I don't say what happened, we don't know what happened. But I think when we collect all of the material together, we get a broader sense of what were the kinds of resistances. So which is, I think I was trying to highlight, it's not like everything was implemented as commanded. The very fact that we have this archive, it is because people didn't do things as they were supposed to. It's because people didn't follow the rules that then the state or somebody complained and was like, well, why are these people doing what they are? That we have this generation of commands. So if the import of your question was that, did people just accept this? I would say no. I think there were pushbacks, but I'm more interested here in my book, and I think that is where actually Professor Nandita Sahai's work is really interesting, because she's focused on the resistance part of the story. I was interested in the discourse of power, like what are the ways in which these categories are being constructed or imagined or made in law, and that a certain effort is being put by the state to put its coercive power behind implementing it. And it's not just the state. There are actually local orders of dominance that are coming into play, where we have these groups of mahajans or some other locally powerful group that is waging that battle on the ground. The state is like an added resource for them, but it's the local structure that is actually helping them do what they want to do, or local shifts in the structure. So broadly, I would say yes, there is resistance. We don't have a direct record of it. Then on the question of the role of the Nai or the Barber, I was very interested in that question, but I didn't directly go into the pre-colonial history of that for Marwar. So you're absolutely right. I read about the role of the Nai in carrying wedding invitations. Nais also seem to play a really important role in military, in the military camp. And the most fascinating thing for me was also the kind of the medical role of the Nai. A lot of small surgical procedures, what we would today call medical or surgical or whatever, were performed by Nais. So but I don't really have a sense beyond that of they are never named as untouchables. They clearly were not elite. I think they would come up more in the so-called like Kameen Jati and the niche Jati, but not in this period. Regarding the role of the sweeper communities in the colonial period, that is not something I can really speak to, because I'm not a historian of colonial South Asia. I have not looked into this question, but it's an interesting one. Okay, so Preetam, there were a lot of questions and I tried to capture them. So on this point, that there are a lot of sources about untouchability, including in Ambedkar. So what I found was that Ambedkar is dealing with the origins of caste and untouchability and is looking at a lot of ancient period sources. Like you also gave the example of the 320. So my claim is not that I'm showing that, look, there was untouchability. I'm saying that we know that it existed as an idea and as a discourse, and it existed, as you said, we can find many references to it. But the common response of various kinds of scholars is to say, okay, yeah, it was an idea, doesn't mean it was practiced, right? So I'm trying to say that here we have an example of the legal implementation of this thing, right? And then, so I think in that sense, it is a distinct thing. And like I said, it has been shown, for example, for the Maratha Deccan, right, where we show that the state is intervening in this way. But I think in the sources that I found, I see that not only is there, say, an existing idea of what is the untouchable, and the state is coming and saying, don't do this or do this, but there is also an effort to name and fix who exactly is untouchable and who is not. For sometimes the whole areas, which again, as a scholar, I think of the pre-colonial past, you will be familiar. Generally, states, when they adjudicate social life, they don't make generalizations, right? They say, okay, in this particular case, this is the precedent, this is the custom, this is what should be done. Here we find there are cases in which there is no reference to custom, and there is a term, again, as the work of Professor Sahai has shown in Marwar, called wajib or wajibi, for customary. There is no reference here to custom. There is no justification of anything as custom. It is just these people are achep, therefore they are. So I think it's a different order and a different kind of sources. I'm certainly not claiming that I'm the first person to find the references to untouchability in the pre-colonial past. Regarding your other questions, I actually got the sense that we were on the same page. So maybe, unless I didn't understand your question, I don't know, perhaps I wasn't clear, that I was in fact arguing against or pushing back against the fluidity claim. Precisely as you said, I think the fluidity claim can be used by groups that, let's just say, I have a certain kind of politics, right? But that's not, that's not where it came from. I think I am saying that there was a degree of fluidity, but there were limits to that fluidity, and it is that limit that I have tried to show in today's presentation. So the examples you gave about land laws and differential taxation, absolutely, there was a hierarchy. There was, in that sense, a degree of, ranking, and you could say whatever, putting people in places. But I think the older answer to that would be, there was a hierarchy, but you could move up and down it. You could, sure, in this generation you may not be, but 4 generations later you could be. So I'm trying to say, actually, I don't think that's entirely false or impossible or anything like that. Yes, that is one of the facets of the pre-colonial period, but there were limits. There were certain groups to which that fluidity was extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. I hope. So I'm pushing against the fluidity claim, but I'd be happy to talk more. On the question of the place of women, so here is the tricky thing. I couldn't show it with regard to references to untouchability or the achape or the untouchable, but elsewhere in this argument, I definitely show the ways in which women and the bodies of women are important to the project of defining what is kind of the social, the in-group, and what is not. And in that sense, it is the bodies of the upper caste women that are the subject of that focus, and so here we have with the women themselves saying, oh, we feel uncomfortable going there because our meghwals are hanging out. In other cases, it's also, there are, and I have an article about this, in which there is a policing of the sexuality of the women. There is an emphasis on sort of controlling them. Right. So that is the way in which I find, and that has been shown also, I think, for 18th century, the Deccan particularly. So I think we find parallels here. So for me, other than showing what was going on in Marwar vis-a-vis caste and gender, it was also interesting to zoom out and see that this could be a wider 18th century phenomenon where some post-Mughal or late Mughal polities are going in a much more interventionist direction regarding women's bodies. So that's the extent to which I can say.
No, we'll come to it later.
Sorry, Divya, I do. It's very fascinating lecture. So I'm particularly interested in that Meghwal episode. They go to the center of the town?
Bazaar, I don't know.
Bazaar, but Bazaar is a very important public place.
Yeah.
Hello, ma'am. Can you allow online visitors to ask questions?
Yeah, we will allow you later. Kindly wait.
Thank you.
So you have a group of untouchables who go to the center of the town to celebrate Holi. What is the message that is being given by that community? And what is the response? Is there a forced response? Is the response by force or through the mediation of a court, which could take a little time, or a complaint?
Thank you.
So my point is, if there is, if you look at untouchables, they are not one single composite unit. They're segregated. And there could be people right at the top, at the margin, who would want to push back. And that is the point of fluidity, who would like to push and move elsewhere. Is it also that because the Bengali are leather workers, and that leather working was very important in a state which had, a pastoral kind of supporting economy, and that the traders, etc., also dependent on this kind of work that gave them the power? But I think it is very important that they should step out and demonstrate, challenging the order that requires the confidence of a certain kind. So what does this show of fluidity, and where does the strength come from for Meghwals?
You can answer it before we take on.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I too thought that this was a really important episode, and I, felt it must, in any discussion of this question of the achape or the untouchable, where on the one hand, leather working castes are being classed as achape, but on the other, we have this example of defiance. So I think absolutely, I agree that, as I think the work of Nandita ma'am has also shown, that as artisans, as leather working groups, the role of groups like the Meghwals they were valuable to the state. I will also add that I think future work has highlighted the ways in which groups that were classed, that may have the name of a leather working caste, also did a lot of important agrarian labor, especially in the countryside. This, however, is an urban context from which I have this case. So there was that role, but maybe I would push against that a little bit to say that even today, groups that are called untouchable are immensely valuable. Being economically valuable is not a guarantee of being treated well or receiving a degree of protection from oppression or marginalization or violence. That said, this is a pre-colonial polity. I feel discourses of caste and politics of caste are very different. And there are, in fact, checks of, patron-client relations, the so-called some version of the Jajmani system that existed in Marwar. So there are checks. This is not a brutal, like modern kind of setup. But in terms of the pushback, that is also noteworthy. So in this context, punishments were rarely what we would recognize today. Going to jail was a very temporary thing. It was expensive for a court to keep you in prison for too long. So jail was not a common thing. Fines were the most common thing. Threats were the most common things. Undertakings were the most common things. Expulsion and banishment from the town and the kingdom could also be, right? So in terms of the punishment, I think the punishment was pretty much as bad as it could be. And so it's not that, I mean, it could get worse. Like, sure, there could in theory be a violence or whatever, but for this was within the range of normal punishment for a transgression. And finally, I think the other important thing to note about that particular reference is that it is holy. And we know from scholarship or anthropological as well as historical that holy was a time in which you overturned existing structures, and it was seen as even today I think holy has a little bit of that quality where you break the rules. So I think that may have had something to do with the extra courage that the Meghwals had on that day to go ahead and go into areas they were not supposed to go. So, and in terms of the route it took, we don't know because it doesn't fully tell us. That is the tricky thing about these orders is we don't know what happened. Maybe on the ground there was an immediate response. It simply was not recorded. The only thing sent ahead to Jodhpur was these guys did this, the women complained, and now, give them this punishment. We don't know. It's very possible that's all that happened. But even so, I think it's pretty noteworthy if this goes all the way to Jodhpur and then Jodhpur gives back that, you better tell them they should stick to their quarters. So yes, it's remarkable, but also I don't know if it entirely challenges my push against fluidity.
Now we will take a couple of questions from our online participants. Aparna Balachandran, I can see your hand raised there. Kindly go ahead with your question.
Yeah, hi Divya, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful talk. I wish I was there and not online, but yeah, I just had a question. One of the questions that I had was, when you talk about these state orders, I was wondering on what basis are these lists made, or are these castes delineated, right? The precedence of castes, etc. Because even with the colonial state, there is reference to the colonial state will say, on the basis of these religious texts or on the basis of upper caste custom, these claims are made, right? But what is the basis on which the state makes these claims, or what is the basis on which you see resistance? And so because you've talked about the orders and you've talked about the ways in which they contribute to the sort of hardening of these identities. But are they just orders? I mean, do they not hearken to texts or to custom, etc.? And if they don't, what does that say about the nature of state power at that time, right? That there's that I mean, even the colonial state will say, look, it's on the basis of this or that text that we are making this kind of caste list. So that's one thing. The other thing is I was thinking about the question of law and state law, right? So the conventional argument is that as you see with colonialism and the centralization of legal power and with the growth of a colonial bureaucracy, a paper-based bureaucracy, you see caste identities harden. And we understand pre-colonial legal regimes to be more legally plural, to be more fragmented, etc. Right? And so does that mean that we actually have to sort of rethink the nature of state law and the way it functions in pre-colonial in places like Rajasthan? Because that's the conventional understanding is from more legally fluid, more heterogeneous, fragmented legal system to a more centralized one. And that's one of the reasons why caste itself becomes, it allows for the fixity of caste to be established as the state rules. So I was wondering whether you could talk about the question of law itself, because it seems to me these are legal records, petitions, etc., and that would be
all right.
Important point. Yeah.
Thank you. We can take another question from Ravi Prakash. I can see the hand raised. Please go ahead.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Hi. So in the very first, the sanad you mentioned, I mean, there was also the term Hindu. And so I was just wondering that, so would you say that as the other of the Achut was getting defined, I mean, similarly, this monolith of Hindu became, I mean, emerged at the same time? Because I mean, the slide is at Vigyapti Padra. So I was just mentioning that what happened to the Jain Mahajans at the same time? I mean, did the Mahajan categories included the Jains as well, the Oswals, the Shimalis? And were they also making petitions based on caste lines at this time? So, I mean, what is happening? Because one of the argument is that, there was Hinduism was also a colonial construct and there were sectarian identities earlier. So, I mean, what is happening to the category of Hinduism right now?
Yeah, we have got your point. One more question from online participants, Manoj Jain.
नमस्कार मैडम, क्या मैं अपना प्रश्न हिंदी में पूछ सकता हूँ?
जी जी प्लीज।
जी दिव्या मैम नमस्कार। आपने अभी जब अपना टॉक दे रहे थे आपने बोला था कि हमने देखा कि चमार्स एंड मेघवाल्स वर अप्रोचिंग राठौर कोर्ट कि वो अपनी कास्ट ऑर्डर को चैलेंज करने के लिए, तो क्या एक्सप्लिसिटली उन्होंने ये कहा कि हमको अछूतों में नहीं रखा जाना चाहिए या इस तरह की कोई बात? क्योंकि आपने कहा कि भंगीज वर नेवर अप्रोचिंग राठौर कोर्ट, तो क्या मेघवाल इस तरह की शिकायत लेके गए थे कि हमारे संग अनटचेबिलिटी नहीं होनी चाहिए या फिर हम उस कास्ट से नीचे नहीं है, इस तरह से कि जो कास्ट ऑर्डर की हायरार्की उसमें मेरा लेवल ये होना चाहिए, हमारा लेवल, या इस तरह की बात थी उसमें? थैंक यू
जी धन्यवाद।
Okay.
I think you can answer the question.
Okay, so Aparna, I'll begin with you. Hi, first of all, and thank you for the question and the close engagement. So yeah, the orders do not ever cite anything like, say, the Dharma Shastra or some other ethical code or some other local custom. In these particular cases, they don't cite any body of knowledge or anything like that. And yes, that is remarkable. So I think, I mean, what does it say about the state? I think maybe one way in which I'll answer that question is that sometimes I think there are implicit references or there's something you can take away. So another set of orders that I found that also did not cite custom, okay, and maybe I should zoom out a little bit. So there is a large number of cases in which, a group or a person will approach the state asking for help with something, and the state will say, do what is customary, right? And that is much more in keeping with what we understand about pre-colonial legal regimes. And it sometimes won't even say what is customary. Sometimes it will say that this person says A, B, or C thing is customary, so it should be done because it's customary. And the state will say, awesome, if it is customary, do it, right? But there is this set of orders that I look at, it like this Achek one and a range of others that are part of my book on other issues in which there is no references to why they should be done. The implicit thing is, and this is my reading, is that it should be done because it is correct or it is right in some way. And to me, there is a moral or an ethical kind of value system that we can judge as playing a role. So, for example, one large set of orders is to do with the protection of animal lives. It doesn't say why. It just says killing animals is wrong. Please stop killing animals. And here's what you should do in order. These are the different ways in which animals are killed. They should not happen anymore. So it doesn't ever say why. So what does it say about the state? I think to me, that maybe the state doesn't need to justify. It is not a modern, it is not working with liberal or modern principles as to why does the state exist. It is, there is no force is asking those questions, so it doesn't need to say why you have to do this because the state says you do. So it sounds like you have a follow-up. Okay, so that's one thing regarding the conventional, narratives about law. I do think we need to rethink the nature of pre-colonial states in general. I do think so. In my own view, based on my study of both other people's work and my own, I feel like there is sort of not a sweeping statement we can make about the pre-colonial, that things change over time in the pre-colonial, even in the early modern period. And to me, there is something about the 18th century in which we see far more interventionist states that are not coming from a kind of modern where again you have to like turn to some principle. You have to have, one law for all. They're not coming from those legalistic, those kinds of frameworks. So it is not like a modern state before colonial. I am not making that claim at all. But at the same time, I do think we do need to rethink the nature of law and states in pre-colonial South Asia. And I hope that my own work is a contribution in that direction. To Ravi Prakash, yeah, absolutely. There was that term, and in fact, the term Hindu did come up in that first order. And a lot of my book is essentially about the other half, you could say, of that story. Today, I talked about the Ache part of the order, but my book deals very much with what is happening with thinking the meaning of the word Hindu in this 18th century and pre-colonial context. And I do argue that it is different from what this word comes to mean in the colonial period. So this, I cannot answer that in this Q&A, but I invite you to read my book when it is out later this year. To Manoj Jain, तो हाँ, ये जो चमार और मेघवाल और कई सारी जातियां थी, ये आते थे स्टेट के पास अपनी डिमांड्स अलग अलग लेके, लेकिन जो मैं रिफर कर रही थी वो ऐसे डिमांड्स नहीं थे कि ये कास्ट हमसे ऊपर होना चाहती है या हमें अछेप जातियों के साथ मत जोड़ो, उस टाइप के नहीं थे। जो मैं कहना चाह रही थी कि जो उनके अलग अलग टाइप के मसले थे कि मेरी गाय को कोई मेर उठा के ले गया, मैं क्या करूं, मेरी गाय वापस लाओ, इस टाइप के केसेस, या फिर मेरी जमीन किसी ने कब्जे में ले ली है, मुझे वो जमीन वापस दे दो। तो ऐसे केसेस थे जो मैं कहना चाह रही थी। जबकि मैंने ये नहीं देखा कि भंगी और हलाल लोग इस टाइप की भी कमांड कभी लेके आते हैं या नहीं। मतलब जो डे टू डे रोजमर्रा टाइप कॉन्फ्लिक्ट प्रॉब्लम लेके जो बाकी कास्ट आती थी, इंक्लूडिंग जो चमार और मेघवाल थे, वो हम हलालखोर भंगी कम्युनिटीज में नहीं देखते हैं। तो ये मैं कहना चाह रही थी कि इस तरीके से वो स्टेट और सोसाइटी के इन अ वे बहुत ही पेरिफेरी में, बहुत ही बाहर की तरफ में थे। तो I think I hope that answers your question.
There are more questions from here. Yeah, go ahead.
हाँ दिव्या, बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग लेक्चर था। कैलाश, दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी में पढ़ाती हूँ। तो सबसे पहले सवाल नहीं है, बेसिकली मैं सेम पीरियड पे काम करती हूँ, तो मुझे भी ये मुझे लगता है कि
Can you pull the mic a bit closer?
हाँ, हमें ये, क्योंकि ये सारी की सारी कंप्लेंट्स है, लोग अपील करते हैं स्टेट के पास में, और ऐसी सिचुएशन में कि जब सारी चीजें नॉर्मली हो रही है या वो लोग एक्सेप्ट कर लेते हैं तो कंप्लेन नहीं आती। एक चीज कि हम इनको कितने केसेज हैं जो स्टेट तक पहुंचते हैं, और वो भी इन सब कास्ट के। तो एक तो ये बात। दूसरी ये चीज कि हम महाजन, राजपूत, ब्राह्मण, कारीगर जातियां और कृषक जातियां, हम और फिर अनटचेबल्स, हाँ ये वाली जो जातियां, हम इनको, ये जो सारी जातियां हैं, इन सब के कैसे जाते हैं? जैसे अनटचेबल्स के आ रहे हैं, तो क्या स्टेट या उस समय का जो पीरियड है और किस तरीके से उसको, हर एक कास्ट के अपने अपने रूल्स एंड रेगुलेशन है। महाजन किसी सुनार को कभी घोड़े पे बैठ के शादी नहीं करने देगा। बहुत सारी चीजें हैं जो खाने को लेके, मैरिज को लेके, जो डेथ फिक्स को लेके, सब चीजें चलती रहती है। तो उन सब में हम क्या देखें कि ये इस समय का जो स्टेट है, सोसाइटी है, उसमें ये सब हो रहा है। क्या हम इसको एक्सेप्शनल रखें कि इसको उस समय के अकॉर्डिंग नॉर्मल रखें, या और स्टेट, एक सवाल ये कि स्टेट कभी चल के इंटरफेयर करता हुआ नजर नहीं आता जब लोग आते हैं उसके पास में। हाँ, तो क्या ये कोई वर्ना सिस्टम के अकॉर्डिंग चीजें सेट हो रही है कि रिलीजन के अकॉर्डिंग, या पावर की पॉलिटिक्स है? इसको कैसे देखते हैं ये सारे? और एक लास्ट चीज कि हमें रिकॉर्ड शुरू होता है 1764 से, तो क्या हम इसको पूरी शताब्दी का एनालिसिस देख सकते हैं? हाँ, ये तो पीछे के 25 थोड़ा ज्यादा।
Yes, Kamal ji, go ahead.
I have a brief query, and it's regarding the mention of twice in your records. You have mentioned that Turk word, once in the context of Turkni Choriya, and once in the first distinction where you were showing us the distinction between Hindwan and Achet. So I'm wondering, why do you think that the figure of Halal Khor is central rather than the figure of Turk when you are discussing?
Go ahead.
Okay. तो कंचन दीदी, थैंक यू क्वेश्चन के लिए। तो ओके, आई थिंक आपके सवाल में बहुत सारे सवाल थे। तो एक मुझे कॉमन थ्रेड जो मैंने पकड़ा वो ये है कि हर कास्ट के अपने अपने रूल्स रेगुलेशंस कस्टम्स थे और स्टेट उसके मुताबिक रिस्पॉन्ड करता था। और शायद पूरे ऑर्डर, अगर हम पूरा सोसाइटी देखें, उसमें भी आप कह सकते हैं कुछ रूल्स और कुछ कस्टम्स थे और स्टेट उसके मुताबिक रिस्पॉन्ड करता था। लेकिन एक्चुअली, एंड ये इस प्रेजेंटेशन में मैंने उतना डिस्कस नहीं किया, लेकिन ऐसा नहीं था। वही मैं अपर्णा के क्वेश्चन के आंसर में भी कहना चाह रही थी कि कई सारे ऐसे केसेस थे जिसमें स्टेट बिना किसी, जो बिना कस्टम के रेफरेंस, इनफैक्ट कस्टम के बावजूद, कस्टम के खिलाफ ऑर्डर देता था। ठीक है, जैसे कि एक तो ये भी जो केसेस है ना जिसमें इन्होंने बोला हुआ है कि जो मैंने आज भी केस दिया जिसमें ये साथ पानी लेते हैं, साथ पानी लेते आ रहे हैं, जो महाजन वगैरह उन्होंने अपील की कि ये अच्छा नहीं लगता हमें, हम नहीं चाहते हैं, ये कोई कस्टम नहीं है, ये कोई रूल और रेगुलेशन नहीं है, कस्टम अगर हम देखें तो सब साथ पानी ले रहे हैं। तो ये एक नए सिरे से एक नया प्रेसिडेंट एस्टैब्लिश करना चाह रहे हैं जिसका वो कोई रीजन नहीं देते, बस कहते हैं हमारी मर्याद कम हो जाएगी, ऐसे ऐसे रीजन दिए जाते हैं, राइट। तो इन दैट सेंस जो वो कस्टम था, जो रूल था, वो रेगुलेशन था, वो बदल सकता था। और इस तरह से हम देख सकते हैं कि हम जानते हैं इंटेलेक्चुअली कि कस्टम बदलता था, पर ये एक एग्जाम्पल है कि कस्टम कैसे बदलता था, कि कोई बिना कस्टम के कोई डिमांड दे देता था और अगर उसके फेवर में आ गया जजमेंट, वो नया कस्टम तैयार हो जाता था। तो इन केसेस में ये एग्जाम्पल है। जैसे मैं अपर्णा को भी बता रही थी, कुछ ऐसे ऑर्डर्स हैं जैसे कि जानवरों की जिंदगी बचाने के लिए, जो जीव हत्या के खिलाफ, उसमें कोई रीजन नहीं है, कोई कस्टम नहीं है, एकदम नया है, कहा कि नहीं करो, अब नहीं करना बस। तो ऐसा होता था कि रूल्स रेगुलेशन के बावजूद नई चीजें इंट्रोड्यूस की जाती थी। और फिर वो सवाल जाता है जो अपर्णा भी उठा रही थी कि फिर किस बेसिस पे, कुछ क्या जस्टिफिकेशन था उसका। अगर आप यहाँ कस्टम के खिलाफ जा रहे हैं, जो वाजिब है उसके खिलाफ जा रहे हैं, तो आपको कुछ कहना चाहिए, आप किस बेसिस पे ये रूल दे रहे हैं। नहीं, कोई रीजन नहीं दिया जाता था। वो हिस्टोरियन का काम है फिर सोचना कि कहाँ से ये आ रहा था। तो उसका मैंने अपने काम में, मतलब बुक में, ये आर्ग्यूमेंटेशन देने की कोशिश की कि ये कहाँ से आ रहा है, क्यों हो रहा है, कैसे हो रहा है। बट डेफिनेटली कस्टम इतना भी ऑल एनकम्पसिंग नहीं था कि उसके सिवाय और कुछ होता नहीं था। तो जहां तक ये 18th सेंचुरी का, आई थिंक काफी नॉर्मल है हमारी फील्ड में कि जब आप 18th सेंचुरी किसी भी हिस्से में गए, आप 18th सेंचुरी कह सकते हैं, क्योंकि बहुत लंबा हो जाता है, क्योंकि लैटर हाफ ऑफ द 18th सेंचुरी, लास्ट क्वार्टर ऑफ द 18th सेंचुरी। मैं वो क्लेम नहीं कर रही कि मैं पूरी 18th सेंचुरी के बारे में बोल रही हूँ, बट डेफिनेटली ऑल्दो, मतलब अगर मेरे पास, मैं फैल के बता सकती, आई वुड से कि कैसे ये जो फिनोमिनन है ये एक 18th सेंचुरी फिनोमिनन है, जो शायद मैंने थोड़ा सा हिंट देने की कोशिश की है कि 18th सेंचुरी में कुछ ऐसे हिस्टोरिकल चेंजेस आए जिसकी वजह से जो ये एक हिस्सा है बड़े चेंज का, वो क्यों पॉसिबल हुआ, वो एक 18th सेंचुरी फिनोमिनन था। ठीक है, तो इस तरह से वो यूजेज का। फिर कमल जी, तो ये जो तुरक वाला सवाल है, ये भी मैंने कहा था उस, जब मैंने वो पहला वो जो डॉक्यूमेंट था वो शेयर किया था, मैंने कहा इसमें कई सारे थ्रेड्स हैं जो कि मैं अनरेवल कर सकती हूँ और जो मैंने करने की कोशिश की है अपनी किताब में। तो वो तुरक वाला थ्रेड भी मैंने अनरेवल किया है। और वो मैंने देखा है कि ये जो सोशल इमेजिनेशन है कि कौन हिंदू वहाँ है, कौन अछेप है, ये सोशल इमेजिनेशन में तुरक की जगह क्या है, ये भी मैंने उस पर कुछ रिफ्लेक्ट किया है। एंड आई थिंक मेरी फाइंडिंग्स में ये है कि तुरक एक इस इमेजिनेशन में अछेप का एक हिस्सा था। तो एक तरीके से सिर्फ इस इमेजिनेशन में, इसका मतलब नहीं कि ये जो लीगल बुक्स हैं इसके बाहर जो तुरक थे, जो मुस्लिम थे उस जमाने में, डजंट मीन कि वो सब एक्सेप्ट करके ओप्रेस होके बैठे थे, लेकिन इस इमेजिनेशन में तुरक की जगह अछेप के अंदर थी। और एक अलग तरीके से, सिर्फ तुरक होने की वजह से, मतलब कास्ट का सवाल आप हटा के, एक अलग तरीके से भी तुरक बाहर के माने जाते थे, मतलब हमारे वो हिंदू नहीं है। तो देयर वाज अ डायरेक्ट एक बाइनरी रिलेशनशिप भी था, एक कास्ट से जुड़ा हुआ रिलेशनशिप भी था। तो थोड़ा सा कॉम्प्लेक्स पॉइंट है जो कि मैंने इसको टेकअप किया हुआ है।
वन मोर क्वेश्चन फ्रॉम।
थैंक यू मैडम। मेरा क्वेश्चन बहुत सिंपल है कि जब हम कोई प्रोनाउंसमेंट दे रहे हैं या जजमेंट दे रहे हैं, तो उसकी क्वालिफिकेशन के लिए मे बी एनीबडी, कोई भी दे रहा है, चाहे समाज दे रहा है या कोई इंडिविजुअल दे रहा है, तो उसकी क्वालिफिकेशन के लिए क्या उस टाइम वहां पे अवेलेबल था? स्क्रिप्चर्स की बात छोड़ दीजिए, उसके बाद की बताइए कि स्क्रिप्चर से कोई उन्होंने वहां से ले लिया या कोई धर्म से ले लिया, लेकिन कोई इंस्टीट्यूशनल कोई बात है तो बताइए।
मतलब आप पूछ रहे हैं कि इसका स्रोत क्या था, इसका जस्टिफिकेशन, जैसे आई थिंक, हाँ, तो आई थिंक अगेन ये अपर्णा के सवाल को ही जाता है जो अभी ऑनलाइन अपर्णा ने सवाल पूछा था। एंड आई मीन वो स्रोत नहीं बोलते ही नहीं है, यू नो दैट्स द इंटरेस्टिंग थिंग। आई मीन एक भी दे नेवर साइट के मैं इस बेसिस पे या इस चीज के लॉजिक में मैं बोल रहा हूँ। तो इस पे जैसे एक धर्मशास्त्र के स्कॉलर हैं दूसरे जिन्होंने इस पे लिखा हुआ है, जो कहते हैं कि शायद जो शास्त्र थे उनके जो रूल्स थे वो सोसाइटी में इतने स्टीप हो गए थे कि बिना डायरेक्ट कोट किए हुए भी लोग उससे गाइडेंस लेते थे कि आपको साइट करने की जरूरत नहीं थी। तो लेकिन अब ये ऑब्वियसली एक तरह से एक स्पेक्यूलेशन है, एक कंजेक्चर है, मैं कभी प्रूव नहीं कर सकती कि जिसने वो सोचा था उसके मन में। लेकिन मैं बस ये कहना चाह रही हूँ कि एक स्कॉलर की सोच है कि धर्मशास्त्रिक जो सोच थी वो आपको डायरेक्ट हमेशा साइट करने की जरूरत नहीं थी। एक तो वो हो सकता है, लेकिन दूसरा आई थिंक जो मैं भी कहना चाह रही थी कि इस समाज में जो महाजन कास्ट थी, वो एक्चुअली वो सवाल शायद मैंने जवाब दिया कि नहीं, एनीवे एक हिंदू और जैन का सवाल था। एनीवे जो उनमें जैन ग्रुप्स भी जुड़े हुए थे, राइट। तो आई थिंक जो इस यू नो 1753 से लेके जो ये राजा है विजय सिंह से 18 यू नो यू कैन से 1818 तक मैंने जो सोर्सेज पढ़े उनमें जो मुझे दिखा कि कई सारे जो हम एक पैटर्न देखें तो वो जैन एथिक्स के साथ भी काफी ओवरलैप करता है। अगेन कोई साइट नहीं करता कि ये जैन बिलीफ है, ये जैन वो है, लेकिन अगर हम इस पूरे स्टेट को देखें तो इसमें इतने सारे जैन लीडरशिप थी, इतने सारे जैन मिनिस्टर्स थे कि, और जैन का सोसाइटी में भी इतना इन्फ्लुएंस था, और साथ ही साथ वैष्णव जो सेक्ट्स थे उनका भी बहुत इन्फ्लुएंस था। और ये जो महाराजा थे इन्होंने वल्लभ संप्रदाय में फॉर्मली मेंबरशिप ले ली थी, इन्होंने इनिशिएशन लिया था, तो जो जिसको हम पुष्टि मार्ग भी कहते हैं। तो अगेन वो कभी कहते नहीं है कि हम पुष्टि मार्ग की बात में फॉलो करें, लेकिन जो पुष्टि मार्गीय कई सारे जो प्रैक्टिसेस हैं जैसे वेजिटेरियन खाना, इसमें कई सारे ऑर्डर्स थे कि शराब नहीं बन सकती अब मारवाड़ में, और काफी उसको इम्प्लीमेंट करने की कोशिश भी थी। तो कई सारे जो ऐसे रूल्स थे ये कहाँ से आ रहे हैं, तो मैं कहूँगी एक वैष्णव जैन रिलीजियस इथोस का शायद इसमें हाथ हो सकता है। एंड ये जो डीप अगर हम कह सकते हैं कोई धर्मशास्त्रिक लॉजिक अगर है तो वो हो सकता है, लेकिन ये स्टेट कभी वो कहता नहीं है कि मैं इस बेसिस पे। जी
प्लीज यूज द माइक, प्लीज यूज द माइक।
बहुत सिंपल सा है। क्या आपकी स्टडी के दौरान यू केम अक्रॉस अबाउट गोत्रा सिस्टम इन डिफरेंट कास्ट?
जी नहीं, उस टाइप का
नहीं, कहीं रेफरेंस आया हो?
नहीं आया, जैसा
नहीं, जैसे आजकल जो कभी डिस्प्यूट होता है ना गोत्र वगैरह पे, मैंने तो कभी
इवन टुडे देख रहे हैं कि बहुत जातियों में गोत्रा सिस्टम बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग है अब भी,
जी
काफी रिजिड है
जी।
से फॉर द मैरिटल रिलेशंस, मैट्रिमोनियल मैटर्स में।
मैट्रिमोनियल मैटर्स पे आया, लेकिन ये गोत्रों पे नहीं आया। खाम्प एक नाम की जो लिनिएज है उस पे आता है।
Best by the way. Thank you. Because you have thoroughly studied that period.
Now, a couple of questions and comments of my own lastly before we end.
Sure.
You see, you have obviously made the claim that your principal argument is that you are questioning this fluidity argument, and you are in a way saying that you are not denying that there was fluidity, but you are saying that fluidity had its limits.
Yes.
And you define the limit as the counterposition between those who had a caste and those who were outcast. Basically this. I think, you see, there is a nuance here, which is this. The scholars, historians, anthropologists and others who have given this fluidity argument, I think largely they had the castes between the Brahmins and the untouchables in mind. As far as the status of untouchables in our society is concerned, most serious scholars have accepted that yes, fluidity was very, very limited, and as you rightly said, it was extraordinarily difficult for people belonging to the so-called untouchable castes to improve their status. This has been, to my mind, relatively widely recognized. Now, the point is, you also refer to the Dharma Shastras. The fact is that starting from Manu Smriti and Yagyavalkya Smriti, both of which are pre-Gupta period, you see that there is a proliferation of the so-called untouchable castes.
And the proliferation happens because of a variety of reasons. Some castes start following occupations which are regarded as impure or against morality, and various arguments have been given in Manusmriti and Yagyavalkya Smriti. And then the Gupta period Smritis like Narad, Parashar, Brihaspati, around that period, you see that there is a large multiplication of the untouchable castes because the social and economic structure is changing, and therefore more and more castes, they are falling down in their status because they have started following occupations which in the eyes of the smritikars, are impure or bad professions, etc., etc., or low level professions. Whereas you see, if you look at the Puranic evidence, you take a Puran like Brahmavaivarta Puran, which comes much later, much after the Gupta period, probably even after her 7th or 8th century. Meenakshi ji is here, she would be able to give the exact date. But I think 7th or 8th century, and it focuses on Eastern India more. And you find that new castes which were emerging there in Eastern India, many of them are sort of designated as untouchable castes because on the basis of the existing varna model where certain kind of occupations and professions are regarded as polluting, so that happened there. Now this in a way touches upon your question of why did the orders not give any reasons. You have also said that probably dharma shastras had percolated so much in the society that people did not need to explain it. I doubt that Dharmashastra or knowledge of Dharmashastras had percolated. Rather, it is the local practices of social segregation which had penetrated the minds of people and they had percolated the lower orders. And that is why a coded language could be used by royal edicts or by these orders. It was understood in that local context. So, what is alien to us today, looking back upon it 200 years later, and belonging to a very different mentality and very different kind of social order today and very different kinds of values, these things were probably very very clear to those period. And of course you referred to Holi. Now you see, and you gave the example of Migwals, which our director also raised a question about that. In fact, the evidence from other parts of North India about Holi being the quintessential festival which turned the world upside down is so strong, especially in the urban area, that this entire question of caste segregation, especially at the level of what we describe today as middle castes, I mean not the untouchables, it becomes very different. It acquires a totally different kind of color, because in the modern times, you will see that when we talk about celebrations, it's a very well organized kind of thing. You see in Durga Puja, Saraswati Puja, and in various other pujas. But you see, Holi has been a festival which was always known for its through the centuries, always known for its how should I put it, lack of order rather than any order. And therefore it was very different from everything else. But the most important question that I had was that first one, where I wanted to know, I mean, don't you think that this fluidity thing in any case, it has been given in a specific context of the castes that existed between these two? Yeah, please.
Oh, okay. Acha, I didn't make a note. I thought you were just closing, so I didn't make a note of all your questions. But,
no, you just
but the first one, the first and last one, I would say that I would say that yes, there has especially in anthropological literature, even the old classical anthropological literature, there is this idea of the muddle in the middle. That you have the Brahmin on top and you have the given fixity of the lowest class, and it's the thing in the middle that's confusing to understand and can move around, right? But I think personally that in the last 20-25 years, ever since there have been newer interventions that are much more fixated on taking down the idea of pre-British India as being fixed and being rigid, which was something that was forced upon us by the colonial historians, by colonialism, this idea that only the kings changed, everything else stayed the same. So this has been a powerful idea, okay, to the extent that I think even in common popular imaginations, many people think that caste was fixed. Brahmin ka grandfather tha, grandfather, Nai ka grandfather, Brahmin. People think this is just a fixed thing that at a popular level as well. So the work of, I would say, 20-25 years, especially these last 200-300 years before British colonialism, has been to push against this idea and show no, this was not okay. But I think that in recent years, this has become taken to such a point that, because I think most of these scholars do not focus specifically on castes that were deemed as untouchable, right? Most of the scholars who work on like 1500 to 1800, or for example, even in the work of like the all India kind of caste, what changed with caste, they tend to offer either a big picture argument or they focus on particular groups, but they don't generally focus on the untouchable groups. So I think some people have run with that and gone so far as to either just not directly address the question of untouchability, to kind of fix untouchability with caste and say it was all fluid. And I would say certain groups are also invested in the idea that it was all fluid.
If I may just butt in here, what I'm saying is, who are the scholars who make this specific claim that segregation did not go to the extent of untouchability?
Well, if you
pre-colonial India,
you read, for example, the work of even my own advisor, Professor Nicholas Dirks, you don't find any explicit engagement with untouchability at all. The most, it is what I think it was a field-changing book in the history of caste, which is Castes of Mind, right? Please tell me where in the discussion of pre-colonial India there is any discussion.
Yes, but that is because he's talking about caste as a structure, not about particular caste.
True, but I think some people have run with that argument to say that caste, including untouchability, was an invention of British colonialism, and they take that to say, oh yeah, it was all fluid.
I'm sorry, but I'm a bit skeptical of this claim. Nobody has given the argument that untouchability is an invention of.
No, we will have an argument, discussion on this offline.
Anyway, I think we have reached the end of this discussion, sir. If you want to make some remarks.
No, it's very personal. So, and in a formal occasion, it may not be appropriate, but I cannot but help, since I'm an administrator, I'm not an academician. So it's always very fascinating to be amongst thinkers. And I remember my wife talking about her students, and Divya was always mentioned with as an extremely bright, hardworking girl who showed a lot of promise. It's really heartening to see the promise has been fulfilled. I'm very grateful to you that you've taken out time, you're visiting. We foisted this on you at the last moment to have given such an incisive and brilliant lecture. My deepest gratitude to you. I'm extremely proud of you. Thank you.
I can't help but I have to say no. Thank you so much. That means a lot. As I've, again, not to give it too much of a personal, direction, but as my book is about to come out, as I've crossed many milestones like finishing my PhD, I really wish ma'am was there to, see it. So thank you.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Divya. And I thank all members of the audience. Of course, those who are here, we will continue the discussion over a cup of tea. Thank you.
How do I turn this off? Like this? That's not true, Ravi. I didn't want to.